Hello and welcome to Chautauqua. Chautauqua is a program where scholars and actors perform first-person accounts of famous people in history. The unusual name comes from Lake Chautauqua, New York, where the first Chautauqua was held in 1874. It began as a training course for Sunday school teachers, but it grew into a traveling roadshow where politicians, lecturers, and performers brought information and entertainment to cities and towns across the nation. Today, Chautauqua is a humanities program where audiences watch scholars and actors perform on stage in full costume. By the end of the program, you will have learned a great deal about the history surrounding the character's life by just watching and listening to the performance. Our theme is Voices from the Great War. The famous person being portrayed tonight is the 43rd Governor of New Jersey and the 28th President of the United States. He wanted to make the world safe for democracy. Tonight's Chautauqua character is politician and academic Woodrow Wilson. I'm Angela Rice Beamer at the Germantown campus of Montgomery College. Stay with us.
I am glad as when I look out upon you that you are not too far away from me. For there is nothing so reassuring to a man who is trying to express the public sentiment as getting into real personal contact with his fellow citizens. As I have traveled across this country, mothers who lost their sons in France have come to me, taken my hand, shed tears upon it. More than that, they've added, "God bless you, Mr. President." Why, my fellow citizens, should they pray God to bless me? I advised the Congress of the United States to create the situation that led to the death of their sons. I ordered their sons overseas. I consented to their sons being put in the most difficult parts of the battle line, where death was certain. Why should they weep upon my hand? Call down God's blessing on me. Because those mothers believed that their sons died for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of right by such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and make the world itself at last free. To such a task they dedicated their lives, everything they were and everything they had, with the pride of those who knew that the day had come when America was privileged to spend her blood and her might for the things that gave her birth and happiness and the peace she so treasured. Those mothers believe, and they rightly believe, that their sons saved the liberty of the world, that their sacrifice was made in order that other sons should not have to make a similar gift, the gift of life, the gift of all who died. These men were crusaders. They did not go forth to prove the might of the United States. They went forth to prove the might of justice and right. And all the world accepted them as crusaders. And because of their transcendent achievement, the whole world believes in America as it believes in no other nation. For over 100 years, Europe had depended upon a balance of power to keep her jealous rivalries in check. It seemed as if the world rested precariously on the tips of the bayonets of two great alliances, France and Russia on one side and Germany and Austria-Hungary on the other, with Great Britain moving from one side to the other as she perceived it to be to her advantage and to keep the sphere from tumbling into the abyss. Great armies had been assembled, vast reserves of trained men and stores of arms stockpiled, great machines of war assembled, and detailed plans for their deployment developed. Such prodigious instruments cannot be held in check indefinitely and will eventually and inevitably find a way, like a coiled spring, to release their tensions. In August of 1914, 1 month after her Archduke and his wife had been murdered by Serbian terrorists, and with the goal of humiliating her troublesome neighbor, Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia. But instead of being just another brief, localized conflict, like the numerous ones we had seen before in the Balkans, which would suddenly flare up and as quickly die away, this one ignited a conflagration. You see, Russia had pledged herself the protector of Serbia, and in response to Austria-Hungary's aggression against her smaller southern neighbor, Russia mobilized her vast army. Germany then followed suit and mobilized her reserves, for she had pledged her support to Austria-Hungary. France, now threatened with an attack by Germany, since she was allied with Russia, felt compelled to mobilize her reserves. Vast armies raced to their frontiers, and elaborate plans which had been developed for the event that no one ever thought would happen, plans that had been created just in case, plans that demanded that you strike the first blow. These plans were followed with religious devotion and took on a life of their own, almost as if in a dream, not realizing what lay ahead. The great nations of Europe raced headlong into war. Germany, faced with a war on two fronts, had a war plan which called for her to swiftly attack France from the north with such force as to knock France out of the war, while Russia was still in the process of mobilizing her ponderous but massive army. When France was then knocked out of the way, Germany would turn her attention to Russia. when neutral Belgium refused to allow the German army to pass through her territory on their way to northern France, Germany brought up huge siege guns she had secretly created and quickly disabled the Belgian forts that blocked her way. England, enraged at Germany's attack on neutral Belgium, joined with France and Russia to form a triple entente against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. The French, who had initially sent their forces to the German frontier, assuming the battle would be there, quickly realized the threat to Paris from the north and raced troops to meet the German onslaught. Like great waves, the two armies collided, and what had been the theory of a balance of power proved to be a fact. Stalled along a line that ran from Switzerland to the northern coast of France in an uninterrupted line of trench fortifications. Two great armies faced each other across a no man's land of death. In the east, Germany and Russia soon fell into a similar stalemate. After 6 months of war, and in response to the British blockade of German ports, Germany declared that the waters around the British Isles and off the coast of France to be a war zone, and that any vessel, including those of neutral nations that entered it, would be subject to attack by submarine, or, as the Germans and the world would soon know it, by U-boat. This was a great threat, not only to the Triple Entente, but to America as well. Our economy depended upon the freedom of the seas. Vast amounts of agricultural production would rot in the fields, and huge amounts of capacity of industrial production would be made idle, putting millions out of work if we were not free to export those goods which were not justly considered war contraband. We protested that the very character of the submarine and the nature of its deployment was inconsistent with the principles of humanity, in violation of the long understood rights of neutrals, and sacred violation of the protection of non-combatants. Over the next year, this proved to be the case, as great passenger liners like the Lusitania and the Arabic and ferry boats like the Sussex would be attacked without a moment's warning. Sometimes before they were even aware that they were in the presence of an armed vessel. And the role of Americans who had lost their lives thus on vessels attacked and sunk grew month by month until the roll had grown into the hundreds. The question upon which the peace of the world had depended had been whether this war was a struggle for a new and secure peace, or just another balance of power. It could not be allowed to be just another balance of power. It must be a new community of power. I went before a joint session of Congress and announced that if the German government continued its unrestricted and uninterrupted campaign of submarine warfare against vessels of commerce, America would have no choice but to sever diplomatic relations with Germany. In response, the German government pledged that she would no longer attack passenger vessels and that her submarines would, if unarmed merchant vessels did not resist or attempt to flee, would make every effort possible to protect the lives of the passengers and crew. For the moment, the crisis had passed. As the war continued on, Germany's situation became more and more dire. The German fleet was bottled up in its home port, and the British naval blockade had taken what had initially been food shortages and turned it into famine. Under this pressure, the German government announced just 10 months after it had pledged to respect the rights of neutrals and non-combatants that it would renew its campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare in the war zone around the British Isles and off the coast of France. That she would unleash her U-boat fleet, which had grown from 20 to 120, with orders to sink without warning, neutral or belligerent, commercial or military vessels that entered into those waters. If this outrage was not enough, we soon learned that the German foreign minister had instructed his ambassador in Mexico City to attempt to form an alliance with the Mexican government, promising Mexico both financial and military aid, as well as the return of the lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, if she would agree to attack our southern borders if America and Germany went to war. When confronted with this, the German foreign minister boldly and publicly acknowledged the plot, but said no hostile intent could be seen in this, for it was contingent upon America declaring war on Germany. But what could Germany expect America to do in face of this? On April 2nd, 1917, I went before a joint session of Congress and asked for a declaration of war. 4 days later, such a declaration was passed, and I signed it. America entered the Great War. Our new allies in Europe had been exhausted after 3 years of conflict, but they would have to hold on for almost another year as we would train, equip, and transport an army of almost 2 million to Europe. In the summer of 1918, it would be that army which would lead the last great offensive against the German Western Front. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the guns fell silent. The German authorities, who had, at the invitation of the Supreme War Council, been in communication with Marshal Foch, had accepted and signed the terms of armistice which he was authorized and instructed to communicate to them. The war thus came to an end, for having signed these terms of armistice, it would be impossible for the German command to renew it. It was not then possible to assess the consequences of this great consummation. We knew only that this tragic war, whose consuming flames had swept from one nation to another until the whole world was on fire, was at an end. And that it had been the privilege of our own people to enter it in such fashion and in such force as to contribute in a way of which we were all deeply proud of the great result. We knew also that the object of the war had been obtained, the object upon which all free men had set their hearts, and attained with a sweeping completeness which even then we did not realize. Armed imperialism, which the men conceived who had been but yesterday the masters of Germany, was at an end. Its illicit ambitions engulfed in black disaster. Who would now seek to revive it? The arbitrary power of the German military caste, which once could secretly and of its own single choice disturb the peace of the world, had been discredited and destroyed. But more than that, much more than that had been accomplished. The great powers which had associated themselves to destroy it were now definitely united in the common purpose of setting up such a peace as would satisfy the longing of the whole world for disinterested justice, embodied in settlements that were based on something much better and much more lasting than the selfish competitive interest of powerful states. There was no longer conjecture as to the objects the victors had in mind. It was their avowed and concerted purpose to satisfy and protect the weak, as well as to accord their just rights to the strong. For with the fall of the ancient governments, which had rested like an incubus upon the peoples of the Central Powers, had come political change, not merely, but revolution. The people who had just come out from underneath the yoke of arbitrary government and were now coming at last into their freedom would never find the treasures of liberty they were in search of if they looked for them by the light of the torch. They would find that every pathway that was stained with the blood of their brothers leads to the wilderness, not to the seat of their hope. They were now face to face with their initial test. We would hold the light steady until they found themselves. And in the meantime, if it was possible, we would set up such a peace as would justly define their place among the nations, remove all fear of their neighbors and their former masters, and allow them to live in peace and contentment once they had set their own affairs in order. To conquer with arms is to make only a temporary conquest. To conquer the world by earning its esteem is to make permanent conquest. I was convinced that the nations of the world that had learned the discipline of freedom and had settled with self-possession into its orderly practice were now about to make conquest of the world by the sheer power of example and friendly helpfulness. One month after the armistice was signed, I would sail to Europe to lead the American peace delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. 6 months later, we would return with what would be known as the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty contained many of the provisions we had called for when America entered the war. Out of the shattered remnants of the Central Empires, the nations of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Turkey were reconstituted. And based on the principle of self-determination, the new nations of Poland, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia were created. And the peoples who had been little more than vassals under Turkish rule were promised the opportunity for autonomous development and eventual independence. And most importantly, the treaty included a covenant which called for the creation of an association, a League of Nations, which would provide the means for the peaceful resolution of international disputes. In the midterm elections of 1918, the Republican Party had gained control of both the House and the Senate. The new Senate Majority Leader and chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, had told his Republican colleagues that Wilson may have won the war, but we shall win the peace. The treaty, which never should have been a partisan issue, soon became one, and the focus of this partisan attack was directed against the League. Senator Lodge and some of his Republican colleagues in the Senate demanded that the treaty be changed and revisions added, which would release America from many of the obligations under the covenant. They focused their attack on Article 10. In the final analysis, the peace of society is obtained by force. And if you are to say we shall not have any war, you have to have force to make that shall bite. The bite in the covenant of the League was Article 10. Article 10 called on the members of the League to respect and preserve, against all external aggression, the territorial integrity and political independence of the other members of the League. Senator Lodge and his revisionist senators demanded that America be released from this obligation. They claimed that this requirement would deprive America of its sovereignty. Any man who chooses to respect the rights of his neighbor deprives himself of absolute sovereignty. But I could not see how I was robbed of any inherent right I ought to retain when I promise not to do wrong. When I promise to respect the very things that, when they were disregarded and violated, had led to a war in which millions of men had lost their lives and civilization itself had been in the balance. I was convinced that if the American people knew the true nature of the League and its goals, that they would pressure these revisionist senators to ratify the treaty. So on September 3rd of 1919, I boarded a special presidential train and headed on a month-long tour around the country to speak in support of the League. I began in the Midwest in Columbus, Ohio. Spoke to 15,000 people gathered in Indianapolis The crowds grew larger and larger as I traveled to Minneapolis and St. Paul. Traveled across the plains to the Pacific Northwest, speaking in Seattle and Spokane, Tacoma, down the Pacific coast to San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, back up to Sacramento, Reno, Salt Lake City, Cheyenne, Denver. On September 25th, I would arrive in Pueblo, Colorado. I would be taken to the newly completed Memorial Hall. By that time, I had given 31 major speeches and scores of addresses. When I walked out upon the stage in Memorial Hall, the hall was filled to overflowing. I told those who had gathered there about the mothers who had wept upon my hands, about how if the League was not formed and America did not join it, I was certain that within a generation there would be another war far more terrible than the last. A war in which the weapons of the last war would seem like toys. I told them that only those who were ignorant of the world could think that any nation, even a nation as great as the United States, could singularly stand alone and write the history of the world. And I asked them to not only always think first of America, but to also always think first of humanity. You do not love humanity if you seek to divide humanity into jealous camps. Humanity can only be welded together by love, by sympathy, by justice, not by jealousy and hatred. I am sorry for the man who seeks to make personal capital out of the passions of his fellow men. He has lost the touch and ideal of America. For America was created to unite mankind by those passions that lift, not by the passions that separate and debase. We all came to America, either ourselves or in the persons of our ancestors, to better the ideals of men, to show them something finer than that they had ever seen before, to get rid of the things that divide and to make sure of the things that unite. It was, no doubt, but an historical accident that this great nation was called the United States. Yet I am grateful it has the word united in its title. And any man who seeks to divide man from man, group from group, interest from interest in this great union is striking at its very heart. When I returned to my train car, I collapsed. The balance of the tour was hastily canceled, and I returned to Washington. A week later, while resting in the White House, I suffered from a paralytic stroke. It had taken 5 months in Paris to construct the treaty with all its complexities and to obtain the unanimous approval of the 31 signatory nations. the Senate would take 9 months merely in criticizing the treaty and then would fail to ratify it. America would not join the League, but 2 years later, on the very anniversary of the armistice, it would sign a separate peace treaty with Germany. The League, severely weakened by the failure of America to join it, would still be organized and put into operations. I would have almost 2 more years in my second term before my wife and I would leave the White House and move to a home that some friends of mine purchased for me on S Street in Washington, D.C., just off of Massachusetts Avenue. When visitors would come, sometimes they would ask me how I had come to grips with the failure of America to join the League. I would tell them that I would rather fail in a cause that I knew someday would triumph than to win in a cause that I knew someday must fail. That I believed in providence and that the things that I had stood for and fought for were in the best interest of America and for mankind. And that if this was true, I was certain that they would someday come to pass. And if it was not true, I did not want them to. When these interviews were over, I often felt quite low, where there had been so much that had been left undone. Then I would think back many, many years ago when I was just a simple college professor on holiday in Scotland. I attended the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the appointment of the great Lord Calvin to his professorship at the University of Glasgow. I never knew a simpler man than Lord Calvin. He had that delightful quality which belongs to so few of us, of an entire absence of self-consciousness. He never seemed to think about himself, but at the banquet which concluded the exercises of the celebration, he was obligated to say something about himself because the toast was to him. I suppose no great physicist ever filled a life with more tangible achievements than did Lord Calvin. I had just been to one of the rooms at the university where I had seen a table almost as long as this room is wide, filled from one end to the other with the inventions of Lord Calvin. Inventions which were primarily contributions to the safety of the navigation of the seas. It was Lord Calvin who made it possible to send a telegram around the globe, and I was standing near him when he received a telegram of congratulations from the other side of the globe by the means of an invention of his own. When the time came for Lord Calvin to speak about himself, he said with that delightful simplicity which characterized him, "If I were asked to choose a single word to express my own impression of my career, it would have to be the word failure." And when everyone cried, "No, no, no," I was standing close enough to see the tears come into his eyes. And he said, "What I mean is this. When I compare the things that I have accomplished to those that I dreamed of accomplishing, there is no other word for it."
We're back, and I'm here with Judd Bankert, who's just performed as Woodrow Wilson. Thank you so much for being here.
No, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity.
We enjoyed your performance.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. How did you first become involved or interested in performing Woodrow Wilson?
Almost 2 decades ago, my wife and I moved to Staunton, Virginia, which is the birthplace of Thomas Woodrow Wilson and is now the location for the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library and Museum. And when I first arrived in town, I've always been interested in history. I attended a reception that was on the grounds of the birthplace. And the curator there saw me and approached me and asked me if anyone had ever told me that I looked like Woodrow Wilson. And I told him I had never lived anywhere where anyone knew what Woodrow Wilson looked like. And he then suggested when Woodrow Wilson left the White House, some of his friends purchased for him a Pierce Arrow, an automobile. And Woodrow Wilson loved to ride in the automobile. That was a great form of relaxation for him. So Edith Wilson, his second wife, had left the vehicle to the birthplace, but it had been stored in a barn for a number of years and was in terrible disarray. And about 10 years before I arrived, the vehicle had been restored. And for the museum, it was a great point of pride, but they had never had anybody to ride in it. So for the next 15 years or so, I just rode in the Pierce Arrow and kind of did this. And then after I retired a few years ago, it gave me the opportunity to spend enough time to create some scripts and start performing. So before this, pretty much all I did was just ride in parades.
How long did it take you to sort of get your script together? And do you have a script that you follow, or is it an outline, or what is that process for you?
It is a script. Sometimes I follow it more closely than others. I'd like to follow it exactly, but I'm afraid my mind sometimes wanders a bit. It takes, well, first off, one of the problems I think with these characters, and I'm just astonished with these people who are able to play multiple characters. I just don't know how they do it. But it's taking the breadth of information, because most of them have, very rich lives and a lot of things to include. So that's been the hardest. Creating my script, over half of the words that you would have heard tonight were actually quotes of Woodrow Wilson, then hooked together with some of my own interpretation. But it is probably 2 or 3 years of research boiled down to about 2 or 3 months then to create this script for the war series. Mostly in the past I've talked more about the progressive movement and his political philosophy and his personal history, but this one almost focused entirely upon the Great War, so this was a new right for me.
He was a compelling orator.
He was.
And the speech, and you used a portion of it that he used to help Americans understand why the country was going to get into the war, was just wonderful. It just had a lot of, it had sincerity, it had the facts, it had the hope, and I think it all really worked together very well.
Well, thank you. Yeah, Wilson was an educator, and he often felt that that was his role, is trying to educate the public. He typically, in each speech, would pick one idea. He didn't try to overload it. He usually spoke for about 20 to 30 minutes. He thought that was about all people could focus on. And he said that to be successful, you had to take a new idea and hook it to something that the people already understood. So he was, when he was at Princeton, he was elected repeatedly the most popular professor, and oftentimes his lectures, there would be standing room only. What he would do is, on his way over to lecture, he would pick up the newspaper and take current events and then weave that into a commentary about a subject matter. And it was not unusual for him at the end of a lecture to have the audience stand up and applaud. So,
excellent.
He was remarkable. By the way, he almost talked exclusively extemporaneously, very seldom off of notes, and then only the simplest outline.
Mm-hmm. Did the armistice agreement vary much from his 14 points? Were there a lot of changes once he got sort of into committee, in a sense, with others?
I think to some extent, but not as much as you think. The 14 points, the first 5 were the critical ones. No secret negotiations and treaties, absolute freedom of the sea, which the British were not excited about because of their great navy, but acknowledged in the treaty, reduction of armaments to its lowest levels possible, but to be able to maintain domestic tranquility, elimination of any economic barriers to trade, and the settlement of territorial disputes, keeping in mind what was in the benefit of the members in the colonies as well as the nations that had control of the territories. Those were the first 5, and the focus. The middle was pretty much all territorial, and then the last of the 14, which was the most important one, and I think Wilson assumed would resolve all the other flaws in the treaty, and that was the creation of this League of Nations.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Article 10 of the League of the development of
the covenant. Yes.
The covenant, he called it, and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge was opposed to that. Can you tell us a little bit more about what was the opposition? You mentioned that it was over sovereignty, but can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. By the way, the choice of the term covenant, Wilson was a Presbyterian, a covenantist, and he chose that term because he thought it was an obligation, a moral obligation that was being formed between the nations. Henry Cabot Lodge, I think, was motivated by 2 things. One of the major platforms that the Republicans had run upon in the 1918 elections was against Wilson. In other words, it was a very bitter campaign, and he was subject to brutal attacks. So it was a huge motivator was to embarrass and humiliate Wilson. But the other was that Henry Cabot Lodge and the revisionists, and these were the senators. There were mild revisionists, and there were ones that they called the irreconcilables, who could accept the treaty under no consideration. Their concern, I believe, with Article 10 was they believed, falsely, I think, that it would reduce America's flexibility in international politics, that we would get drawn into conflicts in Europe or elsewhere, or that our forces may be called upon to go all over the world. Though Wilson would say, if you have a fire, you don't take a hose from, in New York, you don't take a hose from Ohio to try to put it out, you use a local hose. So the assumption, Wilson, was that the League would call on members in that region to deal with regional difficulties. But I think it's a misconception to think of those people as isolationists. They were not isolationists. They actually, I think, were imperialists in the sense that they did not want to have their hands tied by the treaty. They also wanted, one of the clauses they were concerned with was the ability to leave the treaty. And we would see later Japan and other countries would leave the League. They wanted America to be free to leave anytime it wanted. Also, not to be bound by the decisions of the League. So I think it was actually, they saw America as becoming a world power and didn't want to be limited on our ability to exercise. One of the things that one of the revisions they wanted America exempt from was the limitations of its armaments. So they wanted the rest of the world to disarm, but they didn't want America to have to. So I think because that grew into, or between the wars, America became more and more isolated. I think people have misunderstood that the revisionists were isolationists. No, I think America, after the experience of the war, became far more isolationist than these senators were at the time.
Mm-hmm. What were his views on race relations? I have a quote, and you can tell me whether this is a correct quote or not. "Segregation is not a humiliation, but a benefit, and ought to be so regarded."
I'm not familiar with the quote, but I think that would be something that Wilson might say. I think Wilson thought that that oftentimes that the African American communities or opportunities were restricted by whites, and that in fact that community, and I think maybe Booker T. Washington, maybe to some extent, and other leaders, he embraced their attitudes, that community would flourish and could grow more if it was less under the control of the white community. I don't think he saw whites, certainly in the South, of being, at least many of them, being concerned with the welfare of African Americans, but more concerned with the subjugation of them. So I think he thought that at least for a period of time, that community would be. I know it was at least presented in the post office and in the Treasury that that the African American employees would have an opportunity for advancement, and more so if they were segregated. Right. Now, you know,
didn't
was
quite
that
work
was
that
that
way.
was that wishful thinking? Probably. He had been raised in the South. He was in one. There's one discussion that takes place in his cabinet, which, you know, was Woodrow Wilson a racist? Well, he says something that makes you think he was, and it had nothing to do with African Americans. He's talking about at the end of the war about all the white men in particular that had been killed, 16 million, all this, and that this might be, he was very concerned that this might be an opportunity where the yellow race may take on world dominance over the white race. And the fact that you're even having that kind of conversation. But I think we're also in a period of time where Darwinism, eugenics is very close, this idea of racial identity was, you know, so prevalent that he was a victim of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. His wives were very good helpmates, weren't they? Both of them.
Yes.
His first wife, in sort of setting up the social situation in the White House when they first moved in and taking care of all of those matters, and then his second wife after he had the stroke. And didn't he have more than one? One was really very severe, but I thought he had some other health problems as well. And we've only got we've got like 2 more minutes left.
Okay.
But go ahead.
Well, that visit, I talked today about him going to England, to Scotland. He took a holiday because he lost the use of his right arm at one point in time. Wilson didn't learn his alphabet or to read until he was 10 years old. Most people think he was dyslexic, and oftentimes with that you're ambidextrous. He was able to immediately write almost as legibly with his left hand. But yes, he had at one point in time he lost the sight of his eye, which never fully recovered. So he suffered from hypertension his whole life, and had probably had a series of minor strokes.
And I think his father suffered from that as well, didn't he?
Well, his father lived to be in his 80s, and that's a good question. I'm not really sure what he died of. He did die in Wilson's home at Princeton, but at that age, I'm not sure if it was a stroke or not, but I'll have to look into that.
Yeah. Well, we have less than 1 minute left, and people don't often talk about the fact that he had a Ph.D. You don't hear him called Dr. Wilson, but he was.
Yes.
He was a thorough academic.
Right. Well, and I don't think he was elected president when he was 56 years old. I don't think he had ever expected. It was rather a sudden elected governor of New Jersey in 1910, nominated as president in 1912.
So everything went very quickly.
It went very quickly indeed.
Yeah, and he prepared for it.
Yes.
Thank you so much. We have been talking with Judd Bankert, who has performed as Woodrow Wilson, and thank you for joining us. You've been watching Chautauqua, Voices from the Great War. For all of us at Montgomery College, I'm Angela Rice Beamer. Good night.